a priori supposition, because the inherent worth and the infinite value of each and every human soul is part and parcel of this concept of liberty. Now, I want to be very clear. I know a lot of people who don't share my religious beliefs, who share another, and a lot of other people who don't have any religious belief at all and don't believe in God. They too, all of them, are capable and are rendered no less capable of living in freedom than I am. Just the same. One cannot mistake the significant influence of a religious belief system like that most Americans share about the existence of a God and the existence of a Redeemer.
The other thing that I think is important about that conceptually, again, and the reason I insist upon the conceptual level is because of the dangers of associating this with any particular religious viewpoint, or even with a religious viewpoint at all, for that matter. Because as you said, the Constitution works just as well for atheists, or it's just as applicable. There is some real utility, I think, in positing that ultimate knowledge lies beyond you. You know, and if you look at, if you're a totalitarian, let's say you're an atheistic totalitarian, and those things don't always go hand in hand, but generally they do. There isn't anything, even hypothetically, beyond your system of knowledge. But if you're a believer, if you're someone with faith, then you're forced into a position where you always have to admit your fundamental ignorance because you don't have the answers at hand. That's reserved for something that's beyond you, or something that's beyond. And so I've often thought that there's a real useful humility that's part and parcel of belief in something that's transcendent. Because you leave what's omniscient well outside of you, and you understand that that's something that you always approach but never can possibly attain, and that all your systems are partial and incomplete at best. And that seems to me to be a necessary antidote to like a potentially dangerous totalitarianism or narcissism. So I think it's so wise that the system is set up that way. I mean, it puts a tension in it because there's this nesting of the political system inside a set of religious suppositions, but then there's also this insistence and of the separation between church and state. So that's a strange tension, and it's a tough one to sort through. But
no, that's right, and it can seem contradictory. It can seem like it's in conflict. I think once you unpack what government is and how it's used, and you understand human beings and their relationship to each other and to their government, it becomes easier to see how this can work and how it must work. In other words, for me at least, my belief in my relationship with God is the most important thing in this world to me. It's right there with my relationship with my wife and my children. It's something without which I cannot imagine my existence. And it is for that reason, and not in spite of it, that I don't want government touching it. In other words, there is an increasing inclination in society today, including among many Americans, that if something is really important, then it must be something that the government does, promotes, funds, or is otherwise officially involved in. And I think this is a helpful example to all of us of the reasons why it ought to stay out. It is because it's important that it must not touch it. It's not an appropriate place for the use of force. There's good reason why people have, for many, many centuries, sought sanctuary in places of worship. People instinctively recognize that force, the use of physically coercive force, is not something we want to take place inside of a church or a synagogue or another place of worship. And so too with many aspects of our lives that are important. Because they are important, you don't necessarily want government in charge of it.
So it brings up a really complicated question, which is how do you determine? So how do you? Government can become dangerous because of its monopoly on force and its potentially expansive reach. But there's many complex problems that need to be solved, and hopefully people of goodwill can work together to solve them. You're faced then with the necessity of a constant discussion about what government could and couldn't do. And it seems to me that that discussion should be informed by realization that government does some things that are necessary, but that, like any other powerful entity, it needs to face constraints. Part of the political debate is constantly about what that domain of action should be and what those constraints should be. And I suppose the conservatives are constantly on the side of pushing for constraint, at least in some domains, on government expansion. There's exceptions to that, and whereas the people on the left end of the spectrum are more convinced that the power for government to do good is so great that its power should be expanded outward.
That's right, and it's an important discussion to have. And you've got conservatives, and you've got liberals, you've got libertarians, who I'd consider myself a conservative with libertarian leanings. In any event, regardless of where you would categorize yourself, it's important to recognize what government is, what it's not, and what its power is, and which level of government ought to be operating for a particular issue, and which person or office within which level of government is appropriate. So a minute ago, we talked about the federalism, the vertical separation of powers, leaving a fairly stable pyramid-like structure. A few powers at the top, most powers at the base, close to the people. Most people know their state legislator, their city council members. They interact with them at the grocery store. They might recognize them at their child's baseball game. Fewer people know their federal legislators. It's part of the reason why we have fewer powers entrusted at the top. There's also a horizontal protection in the Constitution, one that says once you're inside the federal government, dealing with something that's a federal issue, war powers, regulating trade or international trade or commerce, and so forth. We're going to have three distinct branches. We've further subdivided the king or the Caesar, the king or the queen, the monarch there, into three distinct parts. We've got one branch of government, the legislative branch, Congress, where I work, that makes the laws. This was designed as the most dangerous branch. That's why it's made the most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals, because we have the power to prescribe the rules by which